the battles of the Promised Land, fighting for God's promise. All right, my little warriors, today's story is full of battles, trumpets, marching, and yes, some very high walls that need to come tumbling down. This is the story of how the Israelites entered the Promised Land, a place God had promised to them for generations. But here's the twist. When they arrived, they found out that this land wasn't empty. Nope. It was already full of cities and kings who weren't exactly excited about sharing their land. So grab your shields and your trumpets, because we're about to enter the land of epic battles and divine victories. Now, to understand why these battles happened, let's go back a little. God had promised this land, the land of Canaan, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob way back when. This was the land flowing with milk and honey, a place where God's people would finally have a home. But while the Israelites were busy wandering around in the desert for 40 years, other people had set up their cities and kingdoms in Canaan. They were strong, and they had fortified cities with big, thick walls. These people weren't exactly going to hand over the keys and say, "Oh, welcome, come on in." So why didn't God just clear out the land in advance? I mean, the Israelites were in the desert for 40 years. Surely that's enough time for God to, make some room. But God had a different plan. He wanted his people to learn to trust him and rely on him every step of the way. He wanted them to understand that the Promised Land wasn't just a gift. It was a journey of faith and obedience. They would have to work for it, and through that work they would grow closer to God. When Moses passed away, God chose Joshua, Moses' faithful assistant, to lead the Israelites. Joshua was brave, strong, and trusted God completely. He wasn't afraid of a challenge, and he had no idea just how many were waiting for him on the other side of the Jordan River. So let's start with the land itself. Canaan was a mix of plains, valleys, and hills. It had big cities like Jericho with towering walls, smaller villages, and fields full of crops. The people living there were divided into different tribes and kingdoms, each with its own king. There were Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, and a bunch of other ites, who didn't want any newcomers on their turf. The first challenge for Joshua and the Israelites was getting across the Jordan River. They stood on the bank, looking at the river that was overflowing its banks. Some Israelites probably looked at Joshua, scratching their heads and thinking, "So, are we swimming?" But God had another plan. He told Joshua to have the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant, a very special box that held God's commandments, and step into the river. The moment their feet touched the water, the river stopped flowing. It was like someone hit the pause button on the river. The Israelites crossed over on dry ground, and everyone was probably thinking, "Hey, this is just like the Red Sea, round 2. Once they crossed the Jordan, the first city they came to was Jericho. Now, Jericho was famous for its huge, thick walls. These walls were so big they could have chariot races on top of them. The people of Jericho saw the Israelites coming and immediately locked up their gates. "No entry!" they must have shouted from the top of the walls. Joshua looked up at the towering walls and probably thought, "Well, that's big." But God had a plan, a very unique plan. Instead of fighting or using fancy weapons, God told Joshua, "March around the city once a day for 6 days. Don't make a sound, just march." The Israelites probably exchanged puzzled looks. Wait, just walk around it? No shouting? No throwing rocks? Just walking? But Joshua trusted God, so every day, the Israelites marched around the city in complete silence. Can you imagine the people of Jericho peeking over the walls, watching this army just walk? They must have thought, what are they doing? Is this some new form of exercise? On the 7th day, God had one more instruction. March around the city 7 times, and on the 7th time, Blow your trumpets and shout as loud as you can." The Israelites were ready. They marched 7 times around, and when Joshua gave the signal, they blew their trumpets and shouted with everything they had. And guess what? Those massive walls started shaking, cracking, and boom! They came tumbling down. Jericho was defeated, not by swords or spears, but by following God's unusual battle plan. The Israelites charged in, and Jericho was theirs. After Jericho, Joshua led the Israelites to a smaller city called Ai. Now, Ai wasn't as big or impressive as Jericho, and the Israelites thought, "Oh, this one will be easy." But they forgot something important. God's blessing only comes with obedience. One Israelite named Achan had secretly taken treasures from Jericho, even though God had told them not to take anything. Because of this, the Israelites lost the battle against Ai. They were confused and upset, wondering why they had been defeated. When Joshua prayed, God revealed Achan's disobedience. After Achan confessed, the Israelites learned a big lesson. God's blessings require obedience. With that lesson learned, they went back to Ai, fought again, and this time they won. After Ai, the Israelites were becoming famous in Canaan. Other kings were starting to worry. They thought, "We need to form an alliance, or these Israelites will take all of Canaan." But one group, the Gibeonites, had a different plan. They decided to trick the Israelites. They dressed up in old clothes, packed stale bread, and walked over to Joshua, looking like they had traveled from far, far away. They said, "We're from a distant land, make a peace treaty with us." Joshua and the Israelites looked at their ragged clothes and moldy bread and thought, "Yep, these guys must have come from a long way." So they made a peace treaty. But a few days later, they found out the Gibeonites were actually their neighbors. The Israelites had been tricked, but they kept their promise and protected the Gibeonites from other kings who wanted to fight them. The long day and the defeat of 5 kings. As the Israelites continued to conquer the land, 5 kings in the south of Canaan decided to join forces and attack the Gibeonites because of their treaty with Israel. The Gibeonites called for help, and Joshua, being a man of his word, marched all night to defend them. When they arrived, God helped them defeat the 5 kings' armies. But as the battle raged, Joshua saw the sun starting to set. They needed more daylight to finish the fight, so Joshua prayed, "Sun, stand still!" And guess what? God made the sun stay in the sky until they won the battle. Imagine that, an extra long day just to ensure victory. Why they fought, learning trust and obedience. Now you might wonder, why did they have to fight at all? Couldn't God just clear out the kings before they arrived? Well, these battles taught the Israelites to trust in God, to obey His commands, and to rely on His strength rather than their own. Each victory was a reminder that it was God's power, not theirs, that would bring them to victory. They weren't just fighting for land. They were learning to be God's people, faithful and obedient. Through each battle, God showed them that His ways might seem unusual, like marching around Jericho or making the sun stand still, but they were always perfect. And with each step, the Israelites grew stronger in faith. After many battles and many victories, the land of Canaan was finally theirs. Each tribe received its own portion of land, and the Israelites began to settle, build, and grow as God's chosen people in the land He had promised to them. Connecting to Jesus. Now, my dear ones, what do these battles have to do with Jesus? Just as Joshua led the Israelites to victory, Jesus leads us to victory over sin and death. He fought the greatest battle on the cross, not with swords or armies, but with love and sacrifice. Jesus showed us that true victory comes from following God's will and trusting Him completely. Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Remember, little ones, that just as God was with Joshua and the Israelites, He is with us too. We may not face battles with armies and kings, but we do face challenges. And just like Joshua, we can be strong and courageous, knowing that God goes with us. Dear God, thank you for the story of Joshua and the Israelites, and for teaching us about faith, obedience, and courage. Help us to trust in you, even when things seem difficult or scary. Thank you for sending Jesus, who fought the greatest battle for us. May we follow him with courage and faith. Amen.